Thanks, Laura. And thanks to everybody who is joining us for this call this morning. I'm glad to be able to be here on behalf of Governor Beshear. I'm glad to be here to bring everyone up to date on the repairs that we are doing to the Brent Spence Bridge. Now, let me start out right out of the gate with thanks to everyone who has been involved with this project from the very beginning. We are today actually 21 days since the accident occurred, and we are 21 days until the project is scheduled to be completed and the bridge opened on December the 23rd. So this is an important milestone, and we want everyone to know that we thank them for their work. Now, let me start with all the inspectors that were with us from the very beginning and the engineers that have been involved in this project, the members of our team at the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, and today, Kokosing Construction, who is on site doing this precision repair work. We're on schedule, actually for a very good reason, because we have this talent assembled. We've also not been deterred by the weather. Now, conditions right now are not perfect, but we are still able to get work done. In fact, Kokosing is working day and night on the project. And shortly, I'll share with you some images that tell us where we are on the project. So you'll remember that last week we were talking about the steel, the structural steel material, the stringer beams that support the upper deck were sourced actually from 4 states. And then they were sent to a fabrication shop in Frankfurt where these steel stringer beams were cut and they were drilled, and then they were painted. Then they were shipped to the project site just at the end of last week. I believe it was on Friday. So the last of those, the 16 beams, have actually been set in place on Monday. The crew finished the connections to these beams, and they were firmly in place yesterday. And we have some photos now, Laura, if you'll help me, we can show some photos that help illustrate the points. This represents the condition after the slab, the upper deck was removed at the site of the fire, and it clearly shows the beams that were compromised. These are the beams that are removed, that have been removed now. And now there are 2 photos showing the new beams. Now this is a drone photo of the condition after the beams were removed of the bridge. Okay, I think the next slide, Laura, the next photo will show this slide shows the actual installation of the new beams by the hoisting, and this slide shows it because I said earlier that we're working literally around the clock, and this slide shows the night work, the installation work at night. Now, these photos will be posted on BrentSpenceRepair.com, our site, which is our one-stop source for regular updates on the project, and of course, some interesting images and pictures as well. So attention now turns to preparing the upper deck for the new driving service. The construction crew will be installing what are called the deck pans, and these are metal forms into which the concrete will then be placed. And before the concrete is poured, the crew will install what's called reinforcing bars, and that's simply will provide a steel grid which reinforces the concrete deck. This is a conventional approach which provides structural integrity for the deck itself. All right. Now, that's not the only concrete work on the project. The barrier walls, that is the walls on both sides of the bridge, they have been removed and they are being replaced. And the crews will be installing the necessary tie-ins for when the walls are ready to be poured and connected to the bridge deck. Now, this occurs actually on both the upper deck and the lower deck. Now, let me talk about the lower deck, because that's the next section of the work, or the next phase of the work. The scene will actually shift from the upper deck after the new deck is placed. The schedule calls for it middle of next week. Perhaps it might be earlier, depending on the weather. But the scene will then shift to the lower deck, where we will also be removing, as I said, the barrier walls. Those are the protective barriers on both sides of the bridge, both the upper deck and the lower deck. Now, we won't be removing any whole section of the driving surface on the lower deck like we had to on the upper deck. And that's simply because the lower deck, the effects of the fire, the damage by the fire, was not as great at all on the lower deck. So what's occurring there is that we will be hydroblasting, milling, or scarifying, what's called in the construction trades. We'll be milling the lower deck to provide then a connective surface, a good surface over which the new concrete layer of concrete can be installed. That's a surface layer of concrete will go on the lower deck, and we will then install the new barriers on the barrier walls on the sides. Okay, and of course, last will come the striping and installing of new pavement markers. Now, of course, now let's turn to the maintenance of traffic. Another, of course, important part of this project is the maintenance of traffic, and it's taking action, of course, to redistribute 160,000 and perhaps even more vehicles per day who would otherwise be crossing the Brent Spence Bridge. Now, as I think most of you know, the I-71 and 75 merged traffic heading north through the region is directed by a signage detour onto I-275. And from there, drivers can take alternate crossings across the Ohio River, the Dan Beard Bridge on I-471, and the Combs Hale Bridges on I-275. If you need to get into downtown Covington, you can stay on I-71 and 75, going past the detour, and there's a single traffic lane, a local lane open, so that local traffic passenger vehicles can reach the 12th Street or the 5th Street exits. And we have a team at District 6 led by Bob Yeager and Stacy Hans that are working literally full-time on this maintenance of traffic plan. The two projects then are actually in play at one time. That is the bridge repair project and the maintenance of traffic project. But as I've said before, wherever you're traveling in the region, please plan ahead, know your route, follow the detours. And for the next 21 days, I'll ask you again to please be patient. Okay. Now we'll be able to, we'll be happy to take some questions, and I've got Bob Yeager on the line with me. I often refer to him as our 48-year veteran of the Transportation Cabinet and a subject matter expert on a lot of these issues. So Bob, I'll ask you to, I may lean on you for some of the questions. So we'll take questions now. Laura, I think you're going to moderate.
I am. Thank you very much. Okay, just as we get started, for those of you listening, if you have a question, you should have a raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you do have a question, click on that and we will know to call on you, and we'll do our best to do that in the order in which questions are received. We did receive a question via email from Courtney Francisco of Channel 9's WCPO. And her question, I'm going to read out the couple parts of it, and it says, hazardous materials were banned on I-75 North at I-275 in 2013, yet there are signs all the way up to the Brent Spence Bridge that say hazmat stays in the left lane. Can you confirm that the truck wasn't carrying enough of the hazardous materials to require a restriction? And then follow on to that, are hazardous materials banned or not, you said it was up to truckers to know the law. However, the signs leading up to the bridge are contrary to the law. So what do you want truckers to obey, the signs or the federal law?
Okay, is that the end of the question?
And that is
Laura?
the end.
Okay, all right, okay. So let me try to take all of that together. And if I forget something, Laura, if I forget the piece of the question, just bring me back to it. First, I'll say I think we've answered the question about the hazardous materials several times, but I've learned over time myself that sometimes you have to answer a question as many as 7 times, I'm told, before it actually perhaps will, be entirely conveyed or it'll sink in, but I'm happy to do that. So let me say again that the truck that was involved in the accident, the crash on the bridge, was not carrying enough potassium hydroxide for it to be considered hazardous material. So let me say that again. The truck that was involved in the crash on the bridge was not carrying enough potassium hydroxide to be considered hazardous material. So that is to say that it was lawfully, by regulation, it was lawfully on the bridge. But it's not so much about what was being carried by the truck. It's about how much he was carrying. The load did not qualify as hazardous. He was legally permitted to be driving across the bridge. Now, regarding the signage, and then I'm going to come back to what we're actually doing to examine if there are opportunities for improvement, how can we actually improve? That's important. Whenever there's a crisis and there's an after action report, it's important that we look at, how can we perhaps improve? But let's talk about the signage now. The posting of hazardous material signage is not required, but it is allowed. The particular signage indicating trucks may continue on 75 North is only in place to direct truck drivers who may have mistakenly gotten that far north in the restricted route. And it's actually one last reminder that they need to continue north on I-75 rather than east to I-71 and the Lytle Tunnel. Now, I sometimes use the analogy that I've used this analogy. Actually, Bob Yeager and I were just talking about it earlier, that truck drivers are required to get their commercial driver's licenses. And if they're carrying hazardous materials, they have to get a hazardous material endorsement on top of the CDL. They are required to know their routes. And think of it this way, a couple of ways. Drivers are required to follow the speed limit. We as drivers, vehicles in cars, passengers, or in passenger vehicles. And another example of this would be if you're a pilot in a plane. A pilot in a plane files a flight plan. Pilot in a plane, if he's on the approach on a runway or on the runway, will see signage on that runway. I certainly don't know what that signage represents, but that pilot knows, and that pilot is required to know. So I said earlier that every crisis represents also an opportunity. And what happened on the bridge on November the 11th has, of course, given us the opportunity to examine the protocols. And that's exactly what is being done. There have been several conversations and meetings, virtual meetings, of course, where this protocol, where hazardous materials protocols are being examined. And we're using this opportunity to take a hard look at what regulations currently exist and perhaps what might be updated. But I'm going to say again that it's a responsibility of every truck driver, and I think this needs to be really understood and emphasized. It's a responsibility of every truck driver to know his or her route, to plan ahead for those routes and for the conditions and the restrictions and the prohibitions that those routes represent. Those are the rules of the road. So while we recognize that improvement opportunities exist, we also have to recognize that these are the regulations. They've been put in place for a reason, and they are what is governing us today. All right, let me say one other thing on this question. We're taking this opportunity to do some improvements that might not otherwise have been able to get done while the bridge is closed for the repairs. We're actually doing some additional work, some drainage work on the south side of the bridge itself. And there's some new lighting that's being installed, and there's some paving that's being placed on the approaches to the bridge. So again, this illustrates that we're taking this opportunity to examine what we can get done today in terms of actual physical construction or improvements. And we're taking this time to examine any protocols that we might need to update or improve. So thank you, Laura.
Okay, great. We have a question, I believe it's from Thea Stapleton, but I believe this is Todd Dykes from WLWT. So I'm going to allow him to talk right now. And you should be.
Hi. Hey, Laura, thank you. Yeah, can you hear me, Secretary Gray?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I've written it in, I wasn't sure how this would work, but anyway, as a Northern Kentucky driver trying to get across the bridge to Cincinnati to my news station, I consistently notice 471 seems to be really impacted and backed up heading northbound on 275 East. And this may be a question for Bob, and say hello to Mr. Yeager. I'm not sure, but the question would be, I've noticed additional signage over the course of time. Are there other measures that could be implemented? And also, just to alleviate that backup. And then the follow-up would be, have there been any citations issued to drivers, whether a truck or a sedan or whatnot, for violating the concept of letting local traffic use the bridges while the other drivers should take 275 around Cincinnati? Thank you.
I will lean on Bob for that question. Bob, if you want to pick it up, and I'm actually, we can confirm on the citations, but my official order allowed local enforcement and citations to be issued. But Bob, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We're going every day. We're looking at the way the traffic patterns are working, and we're making modifications as we go. And if you drive it every day, you've probably seen some of those changes. The bulk of the traffic right now is traveling, a good portion of that is traveling on I-471. That's the straightest route to I-71. What we discovered as we drove through the patterns, though, that you could take I-275 and hit I-71 if you're going to somewhere like Columbus. So if you're going anywhere past Mason, it's just as quick to do that than it would be to sort of fight your way through I-471. So we've added that messaging there, and that's helped a little bit. Each of these things are gonna help us just a little, but the idea is that typically we would have had months to consider how to reroute traffic, and we did this in days. We have a number of people who are continuously driving the routes to make sure that we're providing as much information and as continuous a service as we can. I think that's extremely important. But I think, as the Secretary mentioned, plan ahead for your routes. Make sure you know where you're going. Look to see what the best times are going. Obviously, if you go in the high peak times, you're going to experience some things. It's extremely difficult to try to put 160,000 cars onto roads that were already semi-congested. I-71 already sees its portion of heavy traffic. We do have some pinch points. We have tried to work through some of those. It's unfortunate that we have those at this point, but I think once we get the bridge back open and things go back to normal, we're still going to be faced with congestion. It's just not what we're experiencing today. So I think patience is a good thing, and again, we're taking in people who are making suggestions. We're looking at those seriously, and if there is anything else we can do, we certainly will do that for the next 3 weeks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Our next question is from James Pilcher.
Good morning, Secretary. 2 quick questions. One following up on that question about 275. The other thing we've noticed is that not only are there big congestions, and Bob, maybe you can talk to this, but we've also noticed that there have been routinely accidents as people try to merge from 275 over to 471. Have you done any counts on that? And then I had a quick question on the construction. I know the beams had to be replaced. Was there any structural damage to the cross girders, the perpendicular sections that hold up those beams? I saw where you had those in there. Was there any structural damage to that? And is there any worry now that cold weather that the curing of the concrete will take longer? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick up the bridge part only because perhaps a little construction background. Bob, you can handle the traffic, okay? All of this, the structure, the main support members of the structure were tested, and they were tested vigorously by our inspectors. And actually, we got 2 opinions from laboratories on the structural integrity of the steel members. So that was done in the first 3 days, James. And in terms of so the bottom line is the structural integrity is solid. I have said several times that this is a safe and sound and sturdy bridge. And the main structural elements are safe and sound and sturdy, okay? Now, in terms of the concrete, I've also said that there will be no cutting of any corners. But the good news is that we've got engineers that have designed the repair work. We've got inspectors that are on site, on deck, and we've also got a contractor that is responsible. Now, they're looking at, in terms of the concrete and the curing, they may apply an accelerator, but if the weather is, depending on the weather, the concrete can be heated from below. And Kokosing, I just had a conversation yesterday with the project manager who confirmed to me that they are planning on heating the deck where the pour is, where the concrete pour and placement occurs. They're planning on that as a standby measure. But they're looking ahead at the weather, and they're certainly seeing glimmers of hope, and they're optimistic. Okay, Bob, you want to pick up on the traffic?
What the part, there was an addition to the part on 471 and the accidents. We experience that similar thing throughout the year when traffic backs up, whether there's been an accident, when things have slowed down, and more cars try to use 471 north from 275. I think the thing is that we are trying to experience that. We're placing signs there to warn motors to get over to the left lane if they intend to take 471. And that was when we also added the signs to tell people that if they were going to go and take 275 to get on to 71 farther north, to stay to the right, to stay out of those lanes. And we think some of that's helped, but we realize that with the amount of traffic that we have out there, we are going to experience some congestion. And with heavy congestion, you'll have some motors who will try to squeeze in and actually force somebody to stop that was would have been behind them, and that could cause a chain reaction. It's unfortunate, but I think the warning is out there. I think it's just a matter of educating the drivers that they just need to be a little more patient.
Okay, Laura.
Okay, actually, that looks like we have answered all the questions. So I think we are done. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, once again, we want to thank everybody. It's our responsibility to keep you updated, and we're trying our best to do just that. So thanks again.